Hey, so I am Jin Ha. I'm the executive director here at Social Planning Toronto, and I'm very happy to be welcoming you all to our second event focused on reducing poverty in Toronto. So, as part of Social Planning Toronto's efforts to bring a new sense of urgency and greater commitment to ending poverty in Toronto, we are hosting a series of events and workshops aimed at building capacity for community agencies and their staff to take action to support Indigenous prosperity and collaborate with the City of Toronto to end poverty. So last week we hosted a conversation on how we might tackle poverty in Toronto more effectively, and we talked about the role of the City of Toronto's poverty reduction strategy can play, as well as the role that community organizations can play, working with the City of Toronto to tackle poverty. Today, we turn our attention to work underway to address poverty and build prosperity for Indigenous communities in Toronto. We're encouraged to see the City of Toronto partnering with the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council to build a distinct poverty reduction plan for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit community members in Toronto. And we're very lucky today to be joined by two incredible leaders, Lindsay Kretschmer and Kenn Richard, to learn more about this work. So I'll start by introducing our two esteemed panelists. Lindsay Swooping Hawk Kretschmer is German and Mohawk, and she was born and raised in Toronto. Lindsay's family and ancestral connections are to Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and Mississaugas of the Credit. Lindsay is a member of the Mississaugas of the Credit. She has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 20 years and currently serves as the executive director for the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, or TASSC, an Indigenous-led nonprofit coalition in Toronto. Lindsay has served on boards and in senior management roles locally, provincially, and nationally within the nonprofit and Indigenous social serving sector. Her education is in business and marketing, women's studies, and alternative dispute resolution mediation. Lindsay is dedicated to social justice and advocacy, which is inspired by her own journey of overcoming personal adversity. So welcome, Lindsay. And Kenn Richard is the lead consultant for the report to Higher Ground, the Toronto Aboriginal Research Project 10-Year Legacy Review and Indigenous Prosperity Action Plan. Both sides of Kenn Richard's family come from the original Métis and Francophone settlements along the Red and the Assiniboine River in Manitoba. He is of the first generation in his family to be raised in an urban environment and graduate from university. He holds a master's in social work at the University of Manitoba and has been practicing social work principally within Aboriginal child welfare since the mid-70s. Kenn is founder and until recently was executive director of Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. Kenn is the recipient of numerous awards and accolades and is recognized for his leadership as a strong children's advocate at both the national and local levels and advancing off-reserve services for Indigenous people. So I'd like to invite Kenn and Lindsay to provide us first with a bit of a presentation and an overview of TARP, the Toronto Aboriginal Research Project, and the Indigenous Prosperity Action Plan. Welcome, Lindsay and Kenn.
Thanks.
Yep. Thank you.
Just first of all, apologies for not having my photograph. I thought we sent a couple of them, but here I am. I'll just begin. I know we have a small presentation of slides that will get us into the conversation. And you'll see the first one is really a metaphorical statement about a different view of seeing poverty and prosperity. It is one that is, and I'm still on the reflective stage of that first slide, it is one that is aspirational to get up, what the language used is often upstream of the issues, or to be able to not just cope with being poor, but to actually prosper. And we entered into, this is the conclusion of my reflection here, a conversation within our community, the Native community, the Indigenous community, to define prosperity, and it's way more than simply having enough money or food. It is to be able to live. There's an Ojibwe word called Minabin Watson, which is an all-encompassing word related to living a life of quality, not just feeding, but feeding others, to live in a collective world, a culturally intact world, and to be able to participate as an Indigenous person in a city like Toronto, which has never been seen as an Indigenous place. These are some of the elements of prosperity as we moved into it. So that's a little opening reflection. Lindsay, I don't know if you want to say something, anything like that. This is like that, but just if you want to just introduce the council, that would be great too. However you want to go next. There you are.
Yeah, I'll go. Thanks, Ken. Perhaps, yeah, I'll start off with just a little bit about what TASSC, Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, does in the city of Toronto. Ken is actually one of the original founding members of TASSC, if I'm not mistaken. So TASSC was founded informally 2 decades ago, or over 2 decades now. We incorporated in 2011. We started off with, I believe, 5 member organizations, and by that I mean Indigenous-led, non-for-profit social serving agencies, who came together, I think, at a time in history where funding resources were pretty scarce, and there was a competition for those resources. And I think it was not always practical nor aligned with traditional ways of working together in collaboration for that sort of notion of collectivist coming together, that less individualistic or Western worldview. TASSC, I think, was formed out of necessity to bring leaders together of different organizations to have conversations about how to advance things that were affecting folks in the city. And some of those things that were affecting folks in the city 2 decades ago continue to be challenging and also opportune, I think, in today's environment. TASSC is a research, policy, and advocacy organization by mandate. We have 24 members, all Indigenous-led, non-for-profit organizations, both locally, provincially, and nationally serving in different ways. We have arts organizations, we have women-specific services, two-spirited services, men's, housing, education, employment, our own legal services. We have Inuit and Métis representation, justice, and a whole host of other services. And so it's actually very interesting because the social serving landscape within Toronto for Indigenous-led services, it's estimated that there's around 30 Indigenous-led, specifically, nonprofits in the whole of the city, over 80,000 Indigenous people living in the city. And TASSC has 24 of these organizations that make up our circle. And so we come together to work on issues that affect us here in the city and those that the member organizations of TASSC are serving. So our mandate is actually quite similar to, I would imagine, SPTs to some degree in terms of that notion of social planning, collectivism, and coming together. So that's a bit about TASSC. And these are our members. You may recognize some of these folks who are out there in the world doing good work. All right, back to you, Ken.
Yeah, so yeah, back in 2011, we were able to, as one of the major projects of what we were called TASSC at that point, the Toronto Aboriginal Social Services Association, to secure some money to take a picture of the community in a general way, but specifically associated with services that are needed and provided or not provided, depending on what you're looking at. But in any case, we had a wish to update the previous reports that had been done, and there hadn't been, when we looked at it, any really reports that sort of do anything of significance in terms of understanding the indigenization of Toronto for many years, a couple of decades. And so we wanted to just do something that took a snapshot for ourselves about the community, but also, as we say, more metaphors for you, stake the ground a little bit and have the Toronto itself begun to appreciate that there is a significant Indigenous community here, which has its unique history and unique place constitutionally, whether you're off reserve or on in the national scheme of things. So we did a substantial report. It was there was actually 2 volumes. It highlighted current issues of the day, And we, 10 years after that tabling in 2011, in 2021, taking advantage of additional money, wanted to have a look at how we did. And what I mean by that is how were we able to address many of the issues? And there were over 100 recommendations, and time does not permit elaboration, but it was really about, the good and welfare of the community on a very general level, specifically though, drilling down, as I said, to social services, and drilling down to some of the structural issues that might be at play, that we know are at play. And I'll just, without numbing us all, go through some statistics. Almost every measure of difficulty in life and life chances, the Indigenous family, the Indigenous child in my world, shows it to be at the lowest and most stressed categories. The poorest kids, the kids are most likely to be brought into care, for example. The lowest rates of home ownership in Toronto today, only 6% of the Indigenous community actually own their home. And Toronto, you know that home security has historically been only tied to home ownership. That hopefully is changing, but so, we have certain demographics that are also creating even more pressures. The demographics of urbanization, every census shows a dramatic jump in Indigenous population, 20% per census. So as Lindsay said, we have about 80,000 people. So we wanted to make a report that looked back at progress made, but also looked forward. We knew, taking advantage of what we already knew, we knew there were structural issues like poverty. There were upstream issues that needed to be addressed. So the theme of the report, To Higher Ground, is really about, again, getting ahead of and getting above some of the structural issues and to achieve that Minabin Watson that I'm talking about. If we go to the next slide, I think.
Actually, Ken, just to give a little bit of additional context to the background and history and how we arrived. So
Sorry.
yeah, that's okay. So to Ken's point, TASSC collectively did amalgamate two funded projects. One was the province of Ontario, to acknowledge them for their support. They actually funded the retrospective review component of looking at TARP originally. And then we combined that work with the Prosperity Action Plan that was funded and supported through the city, specifically the Poverty Reduction Strategy Office. And that work actually was precipitated some years back when we sort of go through this exercise in Indigenous organizations around policy documents and or government produced strategies that may have impacts or implications on our work and or communities by extension. And so one thing we note is that the 2015 citywide strategy didn't adequately capture any sort of mention or attention to how we were going to collectively as a city address the distinctions that come with Indigenous people's poverty and why that looks a little different for us and some of the historical reasons and factors that bring us to where we are today. So I think we were very fortunate in that the city was very willing to collaborate with TASSC and work with us to create a very distinctive co-developed approach, largely led by the members of TASSC and community by extension. And so it took us to the place I think we needed to go to address the issue, because also in that same year that we started meeting with the city to have these discussions, we were looking back on some of the data that was produced by Our Health Counts. You can look them up online. That's Well Living House. One of the striking statistics from 2016 that they discovered through their research efforts with Indigenous communities in Toronto was that 86% of Indigenous folks were living below the low income cutoff in the city. So 86 is a pretty glaring number, and I can't imagine it's improved from that point to this point, particularly with the cost of living increase and where we're currently sitting as a city and the cost of affordability of food and rent. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and so we're super excited, but that's a bit of background on what brought us here and what inspired us to get there.
So the report, and we have to qualify it just a little bit in terms of our sample. It was, the community is quite dispersed, and Toronto is a pretty big town, and there are certainly pockets of Indigenous folks. mostly the engagement with the Indigenous community. And, you know, this is in keeping with what we know is through the social and cultural services that are available to the community. So those who were engaged in the research were primarily users at some level, might have been staff and board, but of the 24 agencies or 23 agencies that are members of the Social Services Council. So that's the data doesn't, it has to be seen in the light of that. And our health counts was similar, and it's a very elusive and difficult community, even for ourselves, who are members of that community, to actually engage, you know, in research. And there's reasons for that. But we did a number of things. We had online surveying. We did focus group discussions online primarily. We had a look at, previous reports and gathered together some information with respect to what others have done. We, at the end of it all, you know, the big message in terms of the writ large banner on what was determined was that the community felt very strongly that it is a unique community, and cultural reclamation or cultural sustenance or cultural maintenance or enrichment, for that matter, was very important in terms of priorities. And not second to, but parallel to, was also a statement very strongly that the community, certainly the sample community, is highly stressed economically at every level that defines good economic health, that people were expressing problems, housing, obviously, but food security, transportation. You know, it's not surprising that many of our community live in difficult to reach communities in Scarborough and north of Lawrence there and Weston, and, you know, so transportation and access and a whole number of things, but basic living needs, you know, as simple as a decent income was flagged by many as something that could not be taken for granted, and that many were highly stressed over. So 1,000 folks, roughly, we thought, notwithstanding the qualifiers on the sampling, was a pretty strong set of marching orders. And if you go to, I think the next slide, Lindsay, I welcome you to also speak to this slide, if you wish.
Yeah, for sure. So as I shared earlier, if we look at the original TARP in terms of what were some of the key themes that were coming through: poverty, visibility, racism, and then some of the items you're seeing listed here all emerged as top issues as identified by community members who were engaged. And TARP 1, the sample size was a little larger. I believe it was over 1,400 folks who were surveyed. And so this time around, I think we saw a lot of those same emerging themes returning a decade later. And I mean, we can point to where and why we experience some of those issues, predominantly due to our history of colonization and contemporary issues surrounding displacement and loss of land, coupled with, you know, limited access or fair access to education and employment opportunities, health disparities, adequate housing and infrastructure, cultural disconnection, language disconnection. I mean, the list goes on. I think it's a very nuanced community. It's very diverse. First Nations and Métis folks here in the city of Toronto, I would say, are coming from all over Turtle Island. We have folks who are moving in and out of provinces and territories, local communities and reserves from everywhere. Some folks actually will live in two places. They may work in Toronto and still live on their in their home communities. We do have something I think we thought was unique to the process for the PRS work, and we'll sort of use the naming conventions interchangeably because it is a complex and robust project. But I think what we really came to was, you know, TARP 1 had a whole slew of recommendations that it sought to achieve. Anecdotally, I think we were able to sort of look back to say, okay, yeah, we were successful in developing new housing initiatives or new education employment opportunities. But I don't think we were ever resourced well to actually implement that work in terms of having an implementation body, a staffing person, TASSC, like many coalitions across the country, because we're not unique. There are Indigenous coalitions in urban centers all over Turtle Island. And I think the one thing that we do have in common is that we have usually one or two staff. So we're not operating on fairly robust budgets. We're operating on small budgets and doing this collaborative work and coming together and planning. And social planning is hard enough as it is without adequate resources. Implementation becomes even more challenging. And so one of the ways we thought to solve that problem, given that we are under-resourced, is to bring together a table of what we were calling the allies table. And Ken and I sort of visioned this sort of notion of bringing different folks from different sectors who were known allies to TASSC, or who were interested allies, who had expressed interest, to come to sit with us to create some semblance of an action plan that sought to respond to what it is that this work seeks to do in terms of the recommendations, so that we could have a clear plan on how we were going to address those recommendations. I think we owe it to ourselves and moreover to the community to take that step to make it an actionable document. And sometimes I think that's where the challenge lies, is it taking it from that place of, we've got the document, we've got all the evidence, but now how do we do the work? And the work gets done with resourcing, adequate resourcing, or more than adequate in our case, to be able to take it where we need to go. But in the meantime, we are, I think, fortunate that we do have a circle of folks who are within TASSC's network that have been tremendous supporters of our work for years and continue to be good allies in helping us to shape what this will look like. And bringing different minds around the table in that way is no different than, what it is we do at TASSC in bringing together the leaders of these organizations. All of these different hearts and minds coming together, I think, takes us deeper in our thinking, in our planning, and in our doing. So I'm looking forward to where we're able to go with this. And maybe I'll leave it there. And Ken, if there's anything I've missed or you want to pick up, please go ahead.
I'll just go into the next slide, which drills down a little bit further on those, the common themes there. No, the slide that is currently being shown. Yeah, right. So the data kind of, categorized itself, because much of the questions were talking circle style, open conversations. So we did, and I know Nick is listening in on this, we did a lot of analysis of the content of what was heard, and we're able to determine 4 specific categories that demanded our attention. One was service quality and accessibility of services generally, but also Indigenous services specifically. Our community is, they have a high expectation of us in terms of our capacity to assist them in their whatever problem they're presenting. So there's quite a lot of conversation about high staff turnover, for example, in the Indigenous sector. People felt strongly that they wanted an Indigenous social worker or helper that reflected them in terms of their worldview, that we had become reliant, many of them felt, on external allies to the point where the Indigenous side of some of our services were in question. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that came out of that is, I would constitute as marching orders. And there was, and I'm sure Lindsay will agree, not much surprising there. I mean, we're a work in progress building this Indigenous sector. I have history myself back in the late 80s, where there were 3 of us sitting around a table going, what the hell are we going to do? So there was very little. There was like 4 agencies. So we've come a long way, but we have to start focusing more on equality according to the community and on making sure we stand true to what we stand for, which is Indigenous services for Indigenous people. So the second one was housing services. Do I need to really talk much about that to you folks? I'm sure you're all in your own way immersed in that issue. But our folks have let me give you a sad set of stats that seem to be intransigent, and that's related to the number of folks who are absolute, what they used to term as absolute homeless, folks that you see sleeping on the grates and in the cubbies and such. 1 out of 4 have typically been an Indigenous person, and recognizing that the Indigenous community is about 1% of the Toronto community. So it's just stark. And it wasn't just that reality that was spoken of, because most of the folks we talked to were actually housed. It was the quality of their housing. And they were even critical of our own Indigenous service providers for not keeping up with the standard that was expected from our community itself. So just because you're poor doesn't mean you have a lower standard, is that what they were saying? And this is a wake-up call for some of us when we start thinking about when we're going to support people in housing, how they're going to live. Child and Family Services it is an open wound. It continues to be an open wound, and I've been an activist within that sector, and I've tried my best, but it's a structural problem. The historical experience of child and family services among Indigenous people is child removal and replacement and placement somewhere far away. And that's a legacy that continues, and not actually so as much in practice, is because things have gotten better, thankfully. But in terms of the trauma that people carry. So when a social worker knocks on their door, it's not necessarily a welcome event. And that's a whole nother conversation, but they wanted to talk about child protection, how it was currently delivered. And again, I'm the founder of Native Child and Family Services, so I'm particularly interested in the issue. And they want it to get better than it has been. And finally, back to my opening comments about prosperity, financial health and prosperity, the recognition that life is really a grind for a lot of our folks, just in terms of the day-to-day, and that they are stultified and kept in one place because of structural issues that are confronting their reality. And we know that. And, my mother had a grade 3 education. You ask her what you should do about poverty, and she would say, make sure people have enough money. So it's become pretty simple in terms of the direction we've had is do something about the economic disparities that continue to plague the community. And they certainly welcome TASSC pursuing that further, which is something that takes us right to the content of this seminar. I mean, what are some of the things we will do? So Lindsay's already referenced the allies table, bringing together folks that genuinely are concerned about the good and welfare of folks and are in a position to make decisions and undertake actions that might provide some kind of amelioration. It is recognized that poverty is so deeply embedded that there's no quick fix. It's an attitudinal shift as much as anything else in terms of our responsibilities to people. But our direction was see it, in a kind of conventional, traditional way. And that is not just having enough money, but also being able to participate in what a good Ojibwe term, literally translated, means participate in a zestful life. And when you think about zestful, it sounds way better than simply being able to afford a day old bread. So we're now in the process of finalizing our kind of action plan associated with this. I asked an earlier question about the Toronto Poverty Action Plan, because we have to sidle back to them and see how we can work together. But we certainly have our marching orders clear. And now I'm going to just back off and have Lindsay comment anywhere she wants. I'm not sure if there's another slide or not, but there you go. Thank you.
Lindsay, did you want to chime in, or shall I
No,
ask you to some
go ahead.
questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you both for that great overview. That was really, really helpful. I have a lot of follow-up questions that I'd like to ask both of you, and I'm really keen to dig into the zestful life idea as well as the allies table. I'm curious to hear, starting with you, Ken, you've been around for decades. You were there when TARP 1 was done in 2011. It was a really significant piece of work. Sounds like there was some really great progress on a number of fronts. When we look at actual poverty levels or the ways in which communities are struggling, we're seeing across the board in Toronto that there was a temporary reduction in poverty levels because of COVID related benefits, government benefits. Now we're seeing people struggling again more so. We're seeing poverty levels on the rise again, and that's not surprising given how many folks are, struggling with affordable housing and food insecurity. Do you have a sense, how are Indigenous community members in Toronto doing since TARP 1, since COVID? I know getting actual data is very, very difficult. We know that the census undercounts Indigenous communities. That was a big, piece that the report that Lindsay referred to, the Well Living House report, our health counts identified. But what is your sense? Like, has anything gotten significantly better since TARP 1? What's significantly worse? You talked a little bit about that, but if you could talk some more, I'd appreciate that.
Lindsay, I'm going silent because in case, I tend to dominate, so.
No, go ahead, Ken. This was your question. I'll chime in if.
Here's what the big thing, we achieved a few things that we can measure. One was, and I'm not sure if this necessarily equates to improvements, but it should. We went from about 11 agencies in 2011 to, what is it now, Lindsay, 23 or 24?
TASSC members are 24, but there's close to 30 at large in the city.
Yeah, so we've had a tremendous development in the Indigenous service response. So whether it's actually impacted poverty, I don't know, but it's certainly, as an Indigenous person, you can get Indigenous services now. When I first started this stuff, I come from Winnipeg, where Indigenous reality has always been, it's hard, you can't ignore it. Toronto, it was easy to ignore because we are in a multicultural city, tremendous diversity, and a small population within that. So what we were able to do, and back to my initial comments, was stake the ground and say there's an Indigenous community. And now look what we have. We have a land acknowledgement. This was unheard of. And even into the 90s, most people in Toronto would have thought Indigenous people lived somewhere on a piece of granite north of Lake Superior. And I love going there, by the way, but the biggest child population of Indigenous people is here in Toronto. So that we were able to achieve that consciousness in government, in the civil conversation in Toronto, I think was tremendous, and it can be brought back to the first TARP report. So we have two things. We have a much better infrastructure, many more options. Kids, for example, in child and family services are not disappearing anymore. A lot of things have really, I think, improved. The cultural services, you couldn't find a sweat lodge in the 80s and 90s without, having it being whispered in somebody's back room that somebody's doing this out there, usually very far away. I think we have like 5 sweats in the city. We have sacred fires. We have a cultural presence here. The ground is staked. Does that make a structural difference? Well, that's another kind of research, but yeah.
Those are real significant improvements. So thanks for that, Ken. Absolutely. It's a good reminder that even though we're all struggling, communities are still struggling, there have been some significant advances. Lindsay, do you want to add a bit more on how things have changed for Indigenous organizations since TARP 1?
Yeah, I think Ken has captured it really well. I would say one of the ways in which things are beginning to, in more recent years, evolve, and I think it's a really good sign. When I looked back at my time with Indigenous-led organizations in my 20s, our funding agreements at the time, I can recall, again, sort of fighting for scarce resources, not having opportunity to unlock or access a lot of different funding pots, particularly municipal funding pots, and often sort of being drawn into funder required box, right? So needing to be able to color within the lines of those funding criteria and requirement, which creates a lot of limitations. So for instance, if, you know, an Indigenous organization was competing for, let's say, a drug prevention or harm reduction funding, with a mainstream organization, we would be required to, you know, develop or build a program of a similar nature. But there are some really unique aspects of Indigenous programming in the city that I think is often not talked about. In that culture, language, access to elders, reclamation, and revitalization. Ken spoke a little bit about this. I think we are beginning that movement of reclamation. We are beginning to see in a post-TRC environment that those 94 calls to action, they mean something. It's not just about reconciliation, it's about truth-telling. It's about acknowledging the past so we don't repeat it in the future. And I think it's about acknowledging that the foundational pieces for organizations to be able to thrive and to support folks who live in this city, regardless of their socioeconomic status, background, nationhood, identities, etc., that there's a strong cultural presence and that folks are able to reconnect to culture, ceremony, and land, and to language. These are all factors that make up who we are as a people. These are things that are, I think, unique to the ways in which we're going to problem solve some of these issues into the future. And they will require more resources, right? So, I mean, going back to what I was trying to say, I think lost sight of it, but I'd look at like a budget, for instance, you know, let's say we applied for something for $100,000. The majority of that would be a staff salary for 1 year to do a program. And then you'd have some for admin, some for programming. Never was there built into a budget line culture and language, ceremony. Those things cost money. It costs money to take kids, put them on a school bus and bring them up to the land outside of the city to be able to access ceremonial activities. These things are expensive and are often not baked into funder thinking in and around how they're going to issue out funding that is either Indigenous specific or not. So I'm starting to see a movement toward funders actually supporting Indigenous organizations and efforts to have greater self-determination, meaning they're sort of becoming more relational. It's not transactional funding relationships anymore. It's actually taking us to a place where we can sit down, have a cup of coffee, get to know each other on a very human level to really discuss the issues that are affecting each organization. We saw unprecedented supports during the pandemic when TASSC went out to fundraise on behalf of the members at the direction of the members. We fundraised to support all of them in different ways. We created a community basket approach based on Indigenous concepts of take what you need, leave what you don't. So regardless of agency, shape or size or longevity or who their populations were that they were serving, we were giving folks equal access to funding to go out into the world to say, hey, you respond at a community local level as determined by your community's needs. Not that of what the funder wants or what we want, but what is it you need? And what we saw was, you know, people were hiring more Indigenous folks from the community, purchasing vehicles so they could extend their outreach. We saw folks getting rental supports and helping with arrears, moving supports, like unprecedented things that we couldn't do before because of so much restriction in and around funding historically. So we're starting to see movement in that direction. I think is great because the folks are up to date too. You know, the Justice Department at the federal level has just released the UNDRIP action plan. The UNDRIP action plan will speak to some of these things around Indigenous people's right to socioeconomic self-determination. And so I think we're starting to see a shift, and it's going to take us to the place that we need to go to help to, you know, develop the solutions and offer our own outcomes as we know them.
Thanks for that, Lindsay. There's some really exciting developments, and some of the approaches that Indigenous organizations are leading and encouraging governments to take is something that we can all learn from. I want to turn for a moment to talk about this allies table. That sounds really, really exciting, and what role you think partners and allies can play in some of the priorities that you talked about, addressing basic living needs. Maybe there's a role or maybe not around cultural reclamation, ongoing work we need to take on around truth and reconciliation. There, you know, was a reckoning in the last few years. There's a lot of non-Indigenous organizations and individuals who want to play a greater role in supporting Indigenous communities. And aside from, you know, saying a few words and doing land acknowledgements, feel sometimes at a loss as to what more they could do. So do you both want to take a turn speaking to this? Lindsay, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, sure. You're right, Jenna. We see a lot of times like Indigenous nonprofits in the sector, for instance, will approach us to say, hey, what can we do? Can we volunteer for your events? Is there something we can do to collaborate more meaningfully? I've tried calling, X, Y, or whatever Indigenous organization. No one's calling me back. Folks have to remember, if there's only 30 of us in the entire city, serving thousands of Indigenous people individually and collectively, sometimes working in partnership isn't going to be as frequent or as commonplace as it might be in the general mainstream not-for-profit sector, in my experience, and I've worked in both. I think a few different ways is, sharing your spaces, offering space, offering land. If you've got land or you've got something that you can offer an organization that's neighboring you, let's say you're, in the Allen Gardens area, there's a number of Indigenous organizations there who may benefit from access to your office, meeting rooms, or land space that you might have. So you can start tackling these notions of sharing in the resources in the way that we once did historically with the folks that first arrived. So sort of returning to those notions of reciprocity and I think that's one thing. I think the other way is to explore secondments. If you have something I don't, how can we do a collaboration together? For instance, TASSC is in a relationship with Toronto Public Health. We couldn't afford to hire a staff person to create the new citywide Indigenous wellness strategy. And so what we negotiated was that we were going to go forward with the city supporting a one-year secondment to TASSC paid for by the city, but working in collaboration. So there are some good examples out there of, I think, ways in which government sectors can get more deeply and more meaningfully involved. And I think it's really just about understanding what is it that you might have to share or to give or benefit. Participating in our events, I mean, that's a simple and easy one. I don't mean to undersell that, but going to powwows, making sure your organizations are taking time for learning all throughout the month of June for Indigenous Peoples Month, as well as, for National TRC Day on September 30th and on May 6th for MMIW. I think there's a lot of opportunities internally. I think it's also about organizations sitting down with Indigenous partners and or consultants or community to go deeper on these issues. What do we at an organizational, at a leadership level, all the way up to the board? What do we need to do to change to be better organizations that are more inclusive and creating space for Indigenous folks to benefit and to be part of our circle in more meaningful ways? Ken?
Well, I was just thinking that there's of tangibility. We have, I think, achieved the staking of the ground and the recognition of the uniqueness and existence, and for that matter, of the Indigenous community. And everybody's got a pretty elaborate acknowledgement now. I'm very curious to hear them all. Sometimes they're a document of, and this is by no means a criticism of you folks, but bear with me. Sometimes it's a ticky box kind of experience. And I don't think anybody really wants that. People actually want to be helpful. So the allies table, back to that question of, represents, we wanted leadership from significant sectors of civil society being defined as, government and the nonprofit sector, and the sort of the institutions that make communities go. Financial services, for example, when you talk about poverty, are a no-brainer with respect to engagement. So we have brought that table together, and we are now about to and we've gone through a bit of a hiatus on it because we've been internally working out to make the document everything we want it to be. Oh my goodness, I apologize for this phone. I'm having a hard time. I know I just have to click this little button here. All right, so I'm totally thrown off in terms of what I was saying, but it was, so the allies table it brings, those elements together for the conversation that starts with what now? And I've been spending, being a sleepless type with a racing mind, thinking about different things that we can do. And there are many things that we can do. But there's certainly principles at play that will govern what we do. One of them is the systems will have to appreciate and respect and uphold some kind of sovereignty in the decision-making process that will be held within the Indigenous context. When I talk about services, I talk about service sovereignty, where you respect that there are Indigenous boards of directors that represent, are accountable to the communities that they serve, and that the principle of respecting that and deference to that is something that up until recently, folks, that was not the case. There was a colonial and paternal approach. So just shifting kind of that, and Lindsay talked about it's not transactional, it's relational. So just understanding that those relations are governed by principles. One of them is sovereignty. The other is the importance of Indigenous culture and cultural maintenance. You know, unlike some communities that want equity, the Indigenous sector wants equity and sovereignty. Oh my goodness, that's a big, you know, that's a double whammy, and not easy for everybody to digest. So this allies table is a place to start the big conversations with the Atkinson Foundation is there. There's a couple of developers there. We're not sure whether we're going to keep the politicians involved anymore. That's going to be a question we'll put to ourselves, but it's to really take bites and to actually come up with tangibilities. So, for example, you know, back when we first started the census on homelessness, you remember back then, some of you know, how controversial it was, that people didn't want race to be part of the equation associated with the questioning. You know, we in the Indigenous sector said, we want race to be part of it because we want you to know the degree to which our community is impacted by homelessness. So with the statistics that we got out of the homelessness surveys back in a number of years now, we were able to reconfigure a funding relationship between the federal government and the city associated with Indigenous housing. And it resulted in a $6 million infusion of new dollars using that data. So getting creative, using existing data, understanding certain principles are at play with respect to the relationship. And I talk about service sovereignty, but it's like that. You know, we're ready to start the next phase. Exactly what that is, I have my personal ideas about that. I would like to see a financial institution that is really like more like a credit union kind of dynamic playing out to not only serve those who are in abject poverty, and there are many Indigenous community people that are, but also those who are struggling. Now, we have a middle class and they can't afford a house either. So, you know, just getting down to some of that stuff is really where we need to go. It's practical and it's deliverable. And at the end of the day, and I'm not a scientist on this, and but it is measurable. So, yeah, Lindsay, I'm exhausted.
Yeah, no, that was great, Ken. I have nothing to add.
Yeah, and Lindsay went first, so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is still tied to the allies question, but not necessarily the formal allies table. You talked, both of you, I think, about the importance of services, culturally appropriate, relevant services provided by Indigenous organizations for Indigenous communities. Recognizing at the same time, we have multi-service organizations, other frontline service providers who include their clients, their communities, include Indigenous communities. Can you talk a little bit about like that distinction between Indigenous serving organizations and the role that non-Indigenous organizations still need to play in serving Indigenous communities? Ken, do you want to go first on that?
I want Lindsay to go first on it because I feel too mouthy.
So
Yeah.
just to recap, Jen, you're asking what role can non-Indigenous service providers play in serving Indigenous people?
Yeah, when it seems like ideally it's Indigenous organizations serving Indigenous communities, but that cannot be the sole end of it. There are obviously responsibilities of non-Indigenous led organizations as well.
Yeah, I think Indigenous folks have freedom of choice. There are a lot of Indigenous folks who in fact prefer to use mainstream services, or will have to at some point, given limitations to our own sector. I think the role that service providers might consider playing in those that are currently actively and or may serve in the future, again, is making sure that there's safe spaces for Indigenous people to be there, to feel included, to feel valued. And again, that looks at your internal operations, your structure, your values, your belief systems. Is this baked into the core of who your organization is, what its views and identity is, what its plans are? Do you have relationships with Indigenous people at a meaningful level, at the community level? Do your staff and workforce have a sense of Indigenous cultural awareness or competency, such that, when serving Indigenous clients, there's a cultural respect and an understanding, I think, that comes with that. And then, sort of maybe the things to veer away from is, this idea of competing against Indigenous organizations for Indigenous specific funding. I think that's a bit of a sore point for a lot of us. It's not to say you can't go and apply to that funding. Certainly you're welcome to do whatever you like, but it is recommended that if you're going to maybe do that jointly with an Indigenous-led effort as partners, because we do have very little resources, and there's even resources that are not Indigenous specific that we can't access sometimes. And so I think being mindful about things like that, being mindful that if you want to hire one Indigenous person to say run in an initiative or a project, I've seen it countless times where that one lone Indigenous person may struggle because they become sort of the go-to person for all things Indigenous. And to be fair, as an Indigenous woman, I am not a Jane of all trades. If you put me on the Toronto Real Estate Board tomorrow to talk about something, I wouldn't be able to help you. Being Indigenous isn't enough, essentially. Like, you still have to come with gifts, skills, and experiences that are suitable to your position or role. I think it's really important, again, to consider, if hiring, to maybe do that again in partnership with Ms. Waybeek or other Indigenous organizations. Maybe consider having more than one. What is their community connection, to understand how they feel supported in and outside of your organization? Do your current policies, are they congruent with things like understanding traditional notions of bereavement and the ways in which that may be different for Indigenous communities? For instance, you'll see in bereavement policies and a lot of collective agreements and internal organizational policy manuals, whereas you've got 3 days to grieve for immediate family only. In our notions of kinship, connection, and care, it doesn't work like that. So it might be a distant auntie who's living 8 hours away from here, and I have to drive those 8 hours and sit 4 days in ceremony. So that 3 days is actually not sufficient for an Indigenous employee. Are you able to smudge in your spaces? Because that's also something you might want to consider for Indigenous clients and or employees. There are so many little and big things. I mean, we could spend all day on that topic alone, I think, but I think it's just about mindfulness, being respectful, and having good working relationships so that you're not alone and you feel supported, and so that there's ways in which we can improve the ways in which we're interacting. Ken?
No, I can't really add to that, Lindsay. It's the only thing maybe to add is, if you're going to do Indigenous services as a non-Indigenous agency, you got to figure out an accountability part to it, because it's all well and good at the front line to get along and to do work together, but at the end of the day, in recognition of service sovereignty and those principles, some kind, like putting people on your boards of directors, for example, that can give not a representation of Indigenous Canada, because nobody's elected to do that, but at least a perspective that comes from knowledge of the community and an understanding of what the needs would be. So just looping back on accountability is important. But there is the broader question: is there a place for non-Indigenous services? Absolutely. In fact, non-Indigenous services are often getting funding for our kids, whether it might be through the Autism Society or whatever. I've seen many times, unfortunately, where people get the funding, but then walk out of the room because they say, "Oh, we respect that it's an Indigenous issue to be solved by Indigenous people." I'm going, well, if you're going to walk out of the room, you better give me the money then, because you can't have it both ways. So that kind of stuff has to be frankly discussed and worked through based on current and contemporary principles of relationship that are all there in terms of the reconciliation process, if you care to look.
Great, insightful answers. Thanks, you both. So I want to ask next, so what comes next for the action plan, and what next with the report? What do you think is critical next steps? And I keep trying to get you to go first, Ken, because you're the
I'll go first. Well, we have to
on the
package it in a way that is digestible to the media, which is what we're working on now. They don't like 100-page reports. They like a press release. So, we're putting that together. We're finalizing, and believe me, we with 23 agencies, consensus is always, a challenge. So just sort of sorting out our common message is something we're pretty much arrived at. So you're going to hear more about it, and it's really the vehicle by which we want to start the actionable part of things is through the allies table, but also through existing Indigenous structures. There is a particular housing group. There's a few other things, Lindsay, that I might not even be familiar with, but just taking the report and using it as a tool an actionable tool, with the measurement being is, how do we anticipate this making a difference? I'm beating my own drum on, not my own drum, others are about financial services. For example, we have some folks who, haven't money, but they don't know what to do with it. And cash money instead of RBC fiscal advice, is the go-to place. And, we want to start looking at that and talk about, income levels. I come from a place where I've learned to understand in child welfare that child welfare is always about poverty as much as anything else. So that's where I hope to see things go. But those are kind of my concluding comments. Lindsay, you want to?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think for me, advocacy and policy are going to play a huge role in how we're able to successfully achieve good outcomes associated with this. I think the allies table is good because, again, it brings together those thought leaders from across those different sectors to take back that information to their different spaces and institutions to hopefully begin that process of reimagining what needs to happen. There's this notion out there always, I hear this word decolonization, not a huge fan because I don't know what it means or how you actually achieve it. But the concept of decolonization, I think, stems from this desire to take what is not serving us in this Western construct and to imagine it in a way that aligns with Indigenous ways of knowing, seeing, being, and doing. And so I think it really is for us about challenging policy, challenging the ways in which these current structures are not serving, are not advancing outcomes for Indigenous folks in the city, are not creating parity for Indigenous folks and other Torontonians to access the same. And to Ken's earlier point, it's not only equity, I think it's sovereignty too. I shared a position paper TASSC did on this because we sometimes conflate, I think, issues and forget that there's some real challenges, I think, that we as a people are faced with uniquely and historically as it relates to this particular land. And so I think some of the ways we also want to see change making too is in new resource developments. It's been, and I can't imagine for those who I sit with in my circle who have been doing this for 4 decades. I've only been doing it for 2, but there are people in our circle who have been for 4 decades fighting for resources to try to build, housing for Indigenous people, to try to reduce poverty without even trying to reduce poverty, if that makes sense, just to create space for the basic living and dignity for Indigenous people in this city. And I don't envy that they've had to spend 40 years or more having to beg for something on our own land. It's challenging, I think, for folks, especially as younger ones, because we're looking at what the older ones did to have, pave a way for us. And so I think some of us in this sort of generation are a little more outspoken about the things that have to change in a good way. And we're going to need good relationships. We're going to need good understanding, and we're going to need a lot of money. And we saw in Hamilton, actually, this is another piece I should have mentioned earlier. One of the other sources of inspiration for TASSC to take up this work was that there's a coalition in Hamilton, much like TASSC, in that it's made up of different executive directors from Indigenous orgs. They advocated to the Hamilton municipality, and they were doing the same, in that they wanted to reduce poverty, increase housing. They were given an investment of 10 million over 10 years. 10 million over 10 years commitment from their city to their Indigenous community. And so in Toronto, we've seen nothing like that, to my knowledge, maybe in the housing sector to some degree, but I doubt any commitment of that caliber, because it's quite sizable. But if it's 10 million over 10 years in Hamilton for a population that's a fraction the size of ours here in Toronto, then yeah, I hope the city of Toronto is ready for those conversations, because we're going to be having them.
So obviously a really critical piece, that investment and funding support to enable all the next steps that need to happen in the follow-up to this work. Do you want to just talk a little bit about what you see as what's needed from the different levels of government as they come to the table around this work? Is it predominantly the city and the province that you've been in contact with because they've been funding this work? And I'm going to open it up to questions to others in a moment.
Sure. So yeah, I would say that there are divisions at the city who are more progressive in our relationships and working knowledge and understanding of each other. And TASSC has some tremendous longstanding and good working relationships with various divisions at the city. Some we work more with than others for different reasons. But the ones we do have, I'd say, are pretty strong and pretty innovative in the ways in which we co-develop and collaborate to create change at a policy and resource level. SDFA, shout out to them. They've been tremendous in supporting the member organizations throughout the pandemic and post. as well as to help us create space to change policy, to affect change at a policy level that will affect the future of funding for all Indigenous orgs in a way that's more positive, we hope. If to understand the dynamics so the Crown under Section 35 has a responsibility to us as a people from a legal fiduciary responsibility. There's this sort of belief out there that Canadians have been misinformed throughout the years through stereotypes and really bad PR and miseducation campaigns that suggest that, well, we have to pay them. We have to pay the rent money for stolen land. And so it's, it's tax dollars. No, I think it's, in fact, should be a conversation about GDP and what percentage of that based on which resources and territories are being extracted from that were traditionally are still traditionally ours. But that's another conversation again for another day. But I do think it's timely for us to begin to have conversations about how do we create change that actually supports real outcomes for Indigenous folks in the future. Because if we look back on what's been the last 400 years for us, yes, we've made progress. Yes, we've come a long way from where we were, but we've a long way to go still. And I think we need to be looking to relationships, innovations, and examples of where we were able to work with all levels of government in healthy ways. And right now, as it stands, the best relationship we have is with the federal government, surprisingly, for TASSC. I speak only for TASSC on that, but it is with the federal government who has consistently funded us for the last 6 years. It's a baseline annual funding that helps to cover the cost of one's salary, coupled with admin and some other project. And so it's not a huge amount of funding, but it's enough that keeps us afloat. And we're grateful for that. The city too has some core lake funding through the CSP that we've been fortunate to being able to have for the last couple of years. The province is, as the name of the place suggests, is MIA. That's the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs. Rob Ford, or sorry, not Rob, the other Ford, gosh, he was just across the street. Doug, that's the one. I always mix those guys up. Doug Ford, when he first came in, he changed the name of the provincial ministry responsible for Indigenous issues. It used to be called the Ministry of Relations and Reconciliation, so MER. Now it's Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, MIA. No pun intended, I'm sure. But no, we don't work collaboratively or actively with them in any big or meaningful way. I wouldn't say our relationships with them are tense. They're just not present. They're not there. And they tend to work more with the PTOs and provincial players. And so there's some lack of access and opportunity, I think, for us in a municipality to go to the province for support across any ministry at large. And then at the city level, again, it's again competing for what's already scarce resources for everybody, let alone us. And at the federal level, I think that dynamic is changing too, because we're in competition for resources constantly, because urban and on-reserve are, this distinctions-based approach that the federal government has to take. The resources are not abundant, and we're no further ahead there either, but relationally, I would say we do well. And the municipality doesn't have a responsibility to us, right? They don't have crown duty in the ways that provinces and federal governments do. Or provincial and territorial governments, sorry. But yeah, I think we've a long way to go in municipalities and to understand more deeply urban issues. I mean, we're seeing in some cities notions of urban reserves cropping up to create that space for the conversation about sovereignty, self-determination, and reclamation of space, land, culture, identity, all of those things. Yeah.
Thanks, Lindsay. Kenn? Role of governments, different levels?
Yeah, well, there's very few governments that are into the tangibility that we're looking for. Most of the investment at the federal level is, some social planning, certainly, but as you know, Lindsay, by far and away, they much prefer to fund a social worker to, knock on a door, or a daycare provider. And I don't want to take away from the importance of that. But in terms of addressing the structural issues, there's not a government that's weighed in on that. We, let me be frank, the city of Toronto's poverty reduction strategy, we looked at that and looked at where it was going, and we said, hang on a second. We don't think you're going to address really the fundamentals of our community. So can we work on a parallel process and at some point come together? Because, no government wants to challenge itself. So, but, while the city does not have a sort of a constitutional obligation or, to recognize or serve its Indigenous community, certainly contemporary progressive thought says otherwise. And the city itself, and, again, I'm the old guy in the room here. I was on the Diversity Our Strength Task Force during amalgamation, and it was recognized at that point that it was time to hive off an Indigenous office, for example, at City Hall. At 20 years later, it came to fruition 20 years after the fact. So it's a slow moving piece of machinery, the city of Toronto. And sometimes it just ties itself up in knots with its own rhetoric and sometimes with its own policy development itself. And I'll give you an example of that. And I developed a number of daycares and nurseries, 4 of them. And to get in funding from the city of Toronto, I had to sign a declaration that I would not discriminate in terms of selection of children to attend the daycare. And we refused to sign that because we wanted to be honest. We were going to discriminate. We wanted Indigenous children to get Indigenous services. But we went through 2 years of conflict on that because the city didn't want its own policy to play out in this, but it had no choice. It said over time, it was just quietly swept under the rug. I'm sure people are still signing those documents today that are proactively trying to serve their own community. So, there are lots of things to work out still in the relationship, from those very small technical things that can have a tremendous impact to the overall commitment to substantive change. I'm just going to include everything I say with one of the proudest moments of public speaking I ever had was at Casa Loma, where I was asked to speak to the Kiwanis Club of Casa Loma's 100th anniversary. And I said to them, kindly, but with a little bit of force, that the mortgage was not paid on Casa Loma, that there was the largesse that is exhibited in a place like that owes itself to 150 years ago, where the building of that castle was through the expropriation of Indigenous land out west in the development of the railways. So the connection between historical experience and contemporary realities and the obligations that come from that, the moral obligations, is where I went with that. At the end of the day, they applauded, but it was a realization that was new to them. And so we're still at that phase of creating a consciousness that is going to allow these substantial investments that are going to be required to actually move our community forward.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Lindsay. I mean, such great examples throughout this conversation about how the needs within Indigenous communities and reconciling what we need to do around poverty for Indigenous communities is such a distinct, unique relationship governments need to address. It's not just that equity piece that we've been talking about. It's recognizing the history of colonialism, the ongoing colonialism, and the need for Indigenous sovereignty all throughout. So lots for all of us to learn. We do have just a couple of minutes to open it up to questions for other folks. I know I've been asking the majority of the questions and so much wisdom coming from Ken and Lindsay. Are there any other burning questions from folks in the room that you want to ask of these two wonderful people that we have for a few more minutes? Feel free to put your hand up and or put it in the chat. Melissa.
Hi, thank you, Ken and Lindsay. This has been really incredible to hear about all the progress being made. And both of you have spoken about some of the challenges, and Ken, you just highlighted a policy issue that kind of touches on some of the challenges in working with government. And I wanted to ask you, we do have a few city staff here joining us today. Do you have advice for them when they come up against these challenges around policy? And a lot of this I know has to do with the fact that the city is a colonial institution. You can't get past the kind of structures that they're in, And so how can people who are working in government kind of get past that in order to allow sovereignty and self-determination to really happen, and for these kinds of strategies to be successful?
Yeah. Oh, do you want me to go first, Ken, or you want to go?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the ways to do that is through, again, having good working relationships and ties to Indigenous communities and to leaders to be able to come together through notions of co-development. So if you've got a policy that's clearly not serving, it's not working, that warrants being flexible and able to open it back up, just as we were historically with the sharing of our resources and lands. And I think that's kind of the place we're coming to. I'll never forget, I once worked for the city for 5 minutes. It's a running joke out there, but anyway, I worked there for 5 minutes and came across an experience where an Indigenous organization was advocating to fulfill an actual TRC call to action. I believe it's call to action number 84, which is to install a highly public monument to commemorate residential school survivors. And so this organization and their leadership came into the city hall to have discussions with some of the decision makers there around installing something in City Hall in the square. And I was trying to support and facilitate those conversations. And I remember standing there and watching the conversation unfold. And what they were told is, well, we can't put anything in the square. We don't really have room. We get requests all the time. We have plaques, we have statues, we already have these things. And she looked the person completely just right in the eye and was like, I'm not asking you. We're doing this. And to her credit, and maybe that wasn't always the right approach. Maybe it's the one that makes people uncomfortable, but with all due respect, yeah, we're doing this. We're doing this because it's important. We're doing this because to really fulfill TRC in a meaningful, actionable way, then yeah, we got to be a little uncomfortable. We got to be willing to change. And not just at that systems level, that policy level, but at that human level. She should never have had to stand there to say, and to challenge them to say we're doing it. And rightfully, she would have done it anyway. We would have come together late at night, we would have done it, because sometimes you feel so defeated. You get to a point where you're like, okay, so to Ken's point earlier, it's like 2 years we had to challenge and to fight for something that is an inherent right. Self-determination for Indigenous people is an inherent right, regardless of our location. And so that's how we start to change the narrative and the thinking, I think. Ken?
I keep thinking of humorous stories related to how policy can become ridiculous. I'll give you another one. We built a longhouse, or a facsimile of a longhouse, as a daycare center attached to an historical building in Scarborough. It was the original farmhouse out at Kingston Road in Galloway. And if you drive by it now, you'll see it's a Victorian structure with a kind of a Cortron steel longhouse attached to it. We fought for, had to hire lawyers, never went to hearing because the historical board of the city of Toronto policies related to maintenance of the historical character of a site. And the argument was that our longhouse shape would compromise the historical significance of the property. And when you just think about that, you got to burst into either laughter or tears, because it just shows the kind of blinders that you can put on for the sake of, some misguided notion, and how you can stick to that until you're confronted with the reality of it, which we pointed out. And, you'll to this day, you'll drive by, you'll see the longhouse. Believe me, we were able to construct it. But, this is the kind of stuff we're still kind of faced with, is an unconscious resistance, because everybody's got the land, back to the land acknowledgement. Everybody's got that. Some of them carry it poorly. I was at a presentation at the Royal, the art gallery, where the speaker said, "Pardon me while I do this land acknowledgement." So we're still got a ways to go on some of this stuff, but there is a consciousness now. There is an unwrapping of all these contradictions and this historical legacies that I find very promising. And I think the younger, I can talk like this now, the younger generation of activists, they don't have to work this. They know now. They get it. So, but but they got an even bigger challenge. My job was to open the can. You know, their job now is to fill it up with something that is going to actually make a difference. So that's what Lindsay's for.
I learned from the best.
Amazing, great story. I really hope that that story about the longhouse, that kind of comment wouldn't happen these days. And there are some exciting things that we've seen in the last few years, and a consciousness amongst younger Indigenous folks that is really, really exciting. Some really great leadership. I don't know if Lindsay, you consider yourself part of that younger generation. I think Kenn considers you that. So you're part of it.
Kind of I'm aging out of it now.
Aging out of it.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for all your great insight and wisdom, and all your great responses. I could keep asking you so many questions, but we're starting to run out of time. I just want to give one last opportunity. I think people are feeling shy about asking questions, but one last chance to ask Kenn and Lindsay any questions about Indigenous prosperity or addressing poverty in Indigenous communities, and the work ahead. We're looking forward. SPT, we want to continue to be in relations with TASSC, and continue to ground our work within those that are most marginalized in our communities, and that includes Indigenous folks. So we will continue to share out data and research and analysis and support the policy work that you're doing. We're encouraged to hear about all the updates around your work, and we look forward to connecting and figuring out how we and our partners can support that work going forward. So that's exciting, and we'll continue to talk about how the City of Toronto's action plan and our work around that can also connect back to the work that you're doing and what role we can as community partners play in all of that. So just a couple of wrap-up pieces if I'm not seeing any more questions. We do have one more event that's related to managing media and deputing, that's coming up next week on Wednesday. So check out our events. If you're not already connected to us to receive updates around poverty reduction, we're putting together a little bit of a list and sending out updates specifically on that. So please stay connected with us and let us know if you want to be added to the list. We also want to remind you that the third term action plan tied to the City of Toronto's main poverty reduction strategy that Lindsay and Kenn talked about not being inclusive enough of Indigenous community needs. That one is going forward to the executive committee on May 7th. So that's not the work that Kenn and Lindsay are doing. It's the other action plan. And then the executive committee the agenda gets released on May 7th, and the executive committee will consider it on May 14th. We will be deputing at that executive committee. If anyone else is interested in speaking on that action plan, that would be the time to do it. We're also hoping to release some stats on poverty levels in Toronto in advance of that. Then that action plan, if it gets forwarded by the executive committee, will go to City Council at their meeting May 22nd to 24th. So once again, thank you, Kenn and Lindsay. Let's be in touch. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We appreciate it.
I'll go. Thanks for having us.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Just like humans, most species of penguins choose to mate with the same partner season after season. Isn't that dumb?
We can hear your TV.
Unlike kind
Oh,
Oh, we
sorry.
better stop the recording.